today on behalf of our sponsor, the Universal Peace Federation USA. And one of the associations of the Universal Peace Federation is the International Media Association for Peace, which we refer to as IMAP. And IMAP recognizes the vital role that journalists play in guarding against totalitarianism and supporting the expansion of freedom. IMAP represents a worldwide professional network of journalists who support a socially responsible and moral media to convey accurate content and address the challenges of our time based on the highest principles of ethical journalism. The title for today's program is Freedom, Faith, Family, or Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, America at a Crossroad. Our host today is Hans Moyer. Hans has been working with IMAP Group for the past 3 years, and he has been creating monthly webinars, and he also serves as the executive director of UPF in Pennsylvania. Hans has a background in public service with the Unification Movement and has traveled extensively in the U.S. and abroad to promote freedom, faith, and family. Welcome, Hans.
Thank you, Ray, and welcome everyone to today's program. IMAP is sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation and serves as its media outreach to promote universal values for peaceful coexistence and mutual prosperity. UPS was founded by Dr. Samyang Moon and his wife, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, in 2005. It is an NGO in special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. Our webinar today will explore the impact of the woke ideology, its consequences in today's world, and offer a counterproposal to this destructive ideology. Our panelists today are Dr. Frank Kaufman, the founder and president of the Settlement Project, and Dr. David Burgess, its educational director. Let me briefly introduce both of our guests today so we can get right into our discussion with them. Dr. Frank Kaufman is the president of 12 Gates Foundation and editor-in-chief of the New World Encyclopedia, an online general knowledge encyclopedia providing accurate and reliable information. Dr. Kaufman's work in the area of religion and peace has involved him in interfaith and humanitarian missions, including extensive work in Israel and Palestine, Croatian refugee camps, Hindu-Muslim conflict zones in India and Kashmir, and revolutionary centers of southern Philippines, the Gulf, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere. He's a graduate of the Vanderbilt University and has written extensively on the history of Christian thought and brings these talents and experience to the Settlement Project to strengthen America, its founding vision, and its future. Dr. David Burgess has a PhD in critical theory from the University of Washington. He currently serves as the educational director for the Settlement Project. He is also the founding literature and politics editor for the New World Encyclopedia. In addition to his academic work, David has 20 years of experience in community engagement, managing 2 501c3 organizations and over a dozen grants. David is currently the finance director for Project Phoenix, having previously served as the executive director. He's been married 42 years and has 2 children and 2 grandsons. Welcome to both Frank and David. Our webinar format today will consist in addressing 4 questions prepared by the panelists. The full series of the lectures, which consists of 6 one-hour presentations, can be viewed at the Settlement Project website, the link for which will be posted in the chat. To provide you with some context for our discussion, we'll watch a short 2.5-minute introductory video on the Settlement Project. EJ, if you could show the video for us, please.
The goal of the Settlement Project is to rescue America and free societies from rising state authoritarianism that abuses power and deprives citizens of our God-given human rights. The second goal of the Settlement Project is to restore a civil, constructive, honorable culture in America, where people who differ can converse, respect one another, and seek ways to build a happy, healthy culture for all, rather than a culture consumed with rage, vengeance, violence, and destruction of morals and decency. In the years since founding the Settlement Project, our leaders and scholars developed a profound and incisive education system that harmonizes people of conscience, a teaching that reveals the origins of current American breakdown and provides a compelling and broad-based alternative. Additionally, we work in close partnership with major figures and groups who expose the determined work of the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party to dismember and defile America's future. This teaching, called WICC education, woke, ideology, critique, and counterproposal, traces the history of the modern period from the French Enlightenment contribution to the gruesome reign of terror, through the Marxist-Leninist contribution to a century of global genocide, up to the present moment in which the same progressive thread and spirit again threatens human life. Elements of today's dark side influence include postmodernist desecration of human purpose and meaning, theories of rage, vengeance, and violence, attacks on the basis of human identity, and the divisive nihilism of identity politics. In response, WICC education counters each era of division with the providence of light and positive purpose that eventually prevailed. The counterproposal embedded in the WICC story provides clear new ground for people of faith, goodwill, and conscience. From this, we can ally with friends and others to recover a bright future for America and for all people in the world to be able to live as free and equal.
Well, thank you very much, AJ. I hope this short introduction has set the stage for our conversation today. If you in the audience have questions or comments during the presentation, please post them in the chat, and our panelists will try to include them in their commentary. So let's begin with the first question. We'll have about 10 minutes to spend on each of the 4 questions. So, Frank and David, in the woke ideology, critique, and counterproposal, you have a section about the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, claiming that many of our present difficulties can be traced back to this period. Can you explain a bit about why you picked this period in relation to current difficulties?
Maybe I should start.
Okay, go ahead.
So,
David, if I may, just give me a quick word,
okay,
if I
sure.
may.
Mhm.
David and I teach together, and in a certain way, we're good cop, bad cop. David tells an accurate account of each of the dysfunctional philosophical eras. That's why he said maybe I should start, because he explains clearly what each era. I come back with a counter proposal, so I think we'll that pattern throughout this conversation. So sorry to interrupt, David, but start as you were about to do. Thanks very much.
Okay, no worries, Frank. Yeah, so my answer to the question is I didn't pick the Enlightenment. It picked us. That is, we are still in an era that is still largely defined by the Enlightenment. So in tracing sort of the history of these secular revolutionary movements, that was the place to begin. And the biggest revolution, happened in the 16th century. So in the medieval age, it was characterized by faith and by God as the subject, and human beings were the object. And so our task as humans was to align ourselves with whatever God's will was. But that changed with the emergence of Enlightenment philosophy, and particularly Descartes. Descartes' cogito, which everybody knows, I think, therefore I am, seems quite innocuous, but what it did was it replaced God as the subject of the human world with human beings. Descartes said, I can't know anything for certain. I have to doubt everything, but I can't doubt that I'm the one doing the thinking. I think, therefore I am. Again, it doesn't sound so revolutionary, but what it meant is that everything has to be based on human reason, right? The human thinker is the source of all truth and all knowledge. And so based on that, we have the rise of what I'll call the rationalist revolution. And it wasn't long before social philosophers picked up on this and they began to create their own philosophies and ideas about how society should be organized. Society, the medieval society, they said, was based on tradition and superstition, and they were going to replace that with reason. So one of the early thinkers that created a philosophy, a social philosophy for a new government was Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And so his philosophy, and the interesting thing is there's a pattern that develops through all of these social philosophers and the revolutions that follow. And that pattern is that they redefine or reject God, they redefine human nature, and they have their own founding myth to replace the story of original sin, and then they try to implement a vision, a social order, a political order based on that. And for those who don't agree, they become enemies, and the enemies have to be eliminated, right? So we see this pattern time and again, but it begins with the French Revolution and Rousseau's thought. Rousseau basically said human beings are actually uncorrupt in nature, but in civilization they become corrupted, and they become corrupted by private property. So his philosophy basically said that, he would abolish private property and that we would follow a general will, and that would lead us to a society and a government based on reason. So I'm sorry for all the philosophical stuff, but ideas have consequences, and so what happened was the French revolutionaries picked up on this, particularly Robespierre, who was the leader of the Jacobin Party, and then in the later stages the leader of the government, and he imagined that what he was doing was implementing Rousseau's philosophy. That was that's how he understood his role. But unfortunately, nothing like the general will ever developed. There were still factions, and the factions fought one another. And so he comes out with this idea that, we're building a government based on virtue, but the opposite side of that is we have to eliminate our enemies. We have to implement terror in order to get rid of them so we can have this rationalist society. So the result, of course, was the reign of terror. So, and that's confusing to people. How does the government based on reason wind up in the reign of terror? But it was always built into the philosophy because they didn't appreciate the value of each individual person. Good and evil becomes defined by which side of the equation you're on. And if you're on the side of the revolution, then you're good. And if you're not, then you're evil. And the evil people have to be eliminated, right? I delve into that because this same pattern exists in the revolutions that would follow, right? And it's still with us today. So anyway, I don't want to take up all the time, but that's a basic answer to the question of why we began, with the Enlightenment and with the French Revolution.
Hans, how much time is left in the 10 minutes for this question?
We've got another 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks.
I think we're
Thanks
doing
for the
good.
summary, David, and the clear explanation. The French Revolution provides a perfect initial model for the subsequent revolutions that end up in in genocide. The French Revolution had the Reign of Terror. We'll hear about the subsequent revolutions. Everybody's familiar with the Marxist Revolution, which ended up in global genocide of very likely over 100 million people. So basically, we find the first occasion. Here's the problem. You already have a religious system. David explained it. You had what was it called? What's it called? The order, the great chain of being, right?
Great chain of being, right?
Right.
Which
We
was the
participate-
medieval philosophy. Right?
Medieval philosophy. We participate in God's great design. And yet, by the time of the French Revolution, God's great design is characterized by a world full of oppression, human suffering, inequality, and something has to be done. So the left side philosophers, like the Enlightenment thinkers that David, they're looking for something. Religion obviously hasn't worked. It's created a society of massive inequality, of grotesque opulence and human suffering. And so they come up with reason. They're hardly villains for doing so. They're trying to solve a problem. Religion has had its chance, a great chain of being. You can't have anything greater than God himself designing everything in which we're swimming around in it. How did we get here? And so the French Enlightenment philosophers say reason will be a better access to coming up with a pattern that won't produce this kind of thing, now that we see what God's great design produced. So it's the first occasion in which religion, in which an alternative to God himself, herself, God's self, is introduced. That's human reason. And yet we see what happens with that. This provides a perfect model for us to go forward into our contemporary time. You have religion, it's not working, try this. And what happens is unimaginable human desecration. What we introduce as the beginning through this initial lecture of the Enlightenment is that two things happened in response to the problem that the French Enlightenment legitimately tried to address. That is that one group of people saw that it's not God's great design that creates human problems. It's the corruption of the elite. It was the corruption of the clergy and the aristocracy that led to the human suffering. So there's another half side of human undertaking that says the corruption of the elite needs to be addressed, not the fact that people are religious need to be addressed. And this other side is the Reformation movement. And so it's an intensity of religious belief, not a fleeing from or departing from religious belief. And with the Reformation, starts to become the cleansing of the church, the production of the Gutenberg Bible, the 95 Theses, eventually the Pilgrims, eventually the founding of America, and the founding of ever greater human freedom and ever greater human equality. So the first lecture between David and I go from this very dark account of a legitimate effort to another option. It's not God and faith and religion per se that inevitably produces these inequalities and human suffering. It's the corruption of the elite. And the reformers intensify religious intensity as a response to purifying and ending the corruption and reintroducing the beneficial values of spiritual paths and spiritual commitments, like the great reformers, including the Catholic Reformation. It's not just we went to Protestant and you guys are the bad guys. The Catholic reformers are great as well. So I think I may have hit our 10 minutes or so, Hans. I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, there are some questions coming in on the chat. If you want to open up your chat, the two panelists, and you can kind of skim those and see where we can fit the answers in. Okay, let me ask the second question, okay? Another part of the WICC education covers the materialism of Marx, the Russian Revolution, and the expansion of world communism. Many people today believe that Marxism still represents the main threat to free democracies. Do you see Marxism as a main force that continues to threaten the US and other free democracies around the world?
Okay, maybe I'll tackle that first.
Okay.
So I would say I would have to break this question down into two components, external threat and internal threat. So internally, I think the answer is unequivocally no. It's not the main threat to our society, and we'll talk more about what that is, I think, coming up. But Marxism was based on class warfare, and class warfare was and is a potent kind of a critique of class-based societies. Right. And a class-based society, you're born in a class, you live in a class, you die as a member of that class, right? So, and America was never a class-based society. We have different social and political classes, but people can move up and down. It's not anything hereditary. So it never really caught on in America the way it did in class-based societies, for one. For two, it's an attack on the political and social and economic system. So while it was popular on campuses among academics until the 1990s, I would say it was extremely popular. There were Marxist professors in almost every field. But and it turned out students who were trained in this, but it didn't penetrate the core of American society, in large part because America is a capitalist society, and the power of business and economic opportunity is great. And turning out anti-capitalists to sit in corporate boardrooms was not a great strategy. And even the workers, used quasi-Marxist rhetoric, but they weren't interested in killing the goose that was laying all the golden eggs. So it never really penetrated deeply into American society in the way it did in other places, right? In France and Italy. In these places, the Communist parties were huge. They were important players, but the Communist Party here was never that significant. And let me add one more thing. In particular, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Prior to that, I was a graduate student. You could walk into the bookstore and look at all the books and all the classes, and they all had Marxist texts. The following semester, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they all disappeared. They weren't, that was no longer. But there was an emerging race and gender studies, and those texts wound up being, replacing the Marxist ones. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But so that's my answer to the danger of Marxism in America. Now, externally, the biggest threat to the United States is still communism. It's the Chinese Communist Party, and they're explicitly trying to take over the world, and they're doing that now in Asia. And if and when they invade Taiwan, what's the American response going to be? So I'm not an expert in China, but we at one point we thought, well, we could just incorporate them into the into the world political and social order. But it's pretty clear now that they're not interested in that, and particularly under Chairman Xi. they've actually, when they adopted market mechanisms, it looked like maybe they were moving away from communism, but under Xi, they're moving back to a more Marxist based communist-based system. So it still remains a huge threat. Which is the bigger threat? I don't know, but at least in foreign policy, it's the biggest challenge that we face.
Thank you,
Thank you,
David.
David.
Time
You
again,
you
please.
guys are a good team. That was halfway. So go, Frank.
It's at 5 again, approximately,
Yeah,
huh?
you got
Okay,
5 minutes
perfect.
plus,
Perfect.
a minute or two. So
Okay, I'll try to be fair. So I'm going to go back to the purely spiritual and philosophical dimension of the paradigm I introduced on the Enlightenment side. Basically, by the time of the end of the 19th century and during the rise of Marx's teachings and the discontent that gave rise to the success of Marxism and the implementation through Lenin, etc., was a new form of exploitation, a new form of human misery, a new form of inequality, and this manifests more as physical discontent. And so the villains this time were not a corrupt clergy, but rather a corrupt capitalist class or bourgeoisie class. And so once again, you have a period of a renewed religious era following the Protestant Reformation, and as I said, including the Catholic Reformation. And lo and behold, with all of the wondrous phenomena of the great Protestant work ethic and the generation of wealth, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but yet again, or still again, human beings are in this grotesque circumstance of inequality. And so once again, something better than God, or better than what the Protestant Reformation or the Reformation had produced, was introduced in its place philosophically. This time it was materialism, not rationalism. So this time, the thing that's replacing God is matter rather than reason. And so a curious thing is that you see that the efforts to solve human difficulties degenerating further down, because rationalism, at least human reason, is something something like God. It's erudite, it's elegant, it's your thoughts, it's your ideals. But materialism is matter, and so communism, Marxism, is seeking to respond to human inequality. This time, looking for a response in physicality, in matter. And so matter ends up going higher than human beings. In rationalist revolution, human beings were the highest. Now matter is higher than human beings. Matter produces human beings. Matter replaces God. Once again, the same counterproposal or impulse is removal or what's the word, destruction or reformation. And once again, it's not the free market, it's not capitalist, it's not human beings exercising our creativity and producing wealth, but rather it's the corruption of the elite. And the robber barons and the bourgeoisie were in fact responsible for human suffering. But what happens, what is needed in response to Marxism is the purification of the capitalist class. And so what is needed there is a type of religious or spiritual force that's capable of meeting the challenges of the growing genius of physicality. Science was the god of the age, and religion and the spirituality of Protestantism needed to become concomitant to the challenge of materialism, which is basically a form of the worship of science in its more elegant form. Where that was met was the effort especially in the United States and in other free democracies and capitalist societies, to try to introduce into prosperous, physically prosperous life, spiritual principles and rules and laws. That's the upper, it's the highest edge of New Testament spirituality. Because New Testament spirituality, I'm a little over time, has a savior who died and we meet him in heaven. So the earth is left a little alone on this one, but still the spiritual force of Christians in corporate life and free society were able to meet the challenge of, you call it Marxism or materialism, almost call it scientism, the worship of science and technology. For any unification people in the audience, many might quickly recognize that New Testament spirituality needed a little nudge or a little help from behind, possibly through the insights of VOC, UT, and other philosophical augmentation to a spirituality that was not this worldly oriented. Thanks for thanks.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen, for covering a broad spectrum of information here in just a few minutes and giving us just the core of what we're trying to address here. I'd like to go on to the third question, and we're very good on time, so feel free to expand a little bit on some of the questions that you see in the chat as well. So one often comes across a reference to a popular term called woke these days. For some, it seems like name calling, and for most, it is unclear just what is meant by the term. Do you think this is something serious that people of faith and conscience should be worried about? Is there some simple way to understand its basic tenets?
Yeah. So to the first point, I mean, woke is the term that they initially used to define, and they promoted the idea. There's, tape of Kamala Harris, saying "Go woke, stay woke." It seems to have fallen a little bit in disfavor, but the problem is that what it is applied postmodernism, and it doesn't roll off the tongue, and most people don't have a clue what that is. So let me talk a little bit about what that means. What is applied postmodernism?
David, your volume a little bit. Speak closer, perhaps, or I'm not
Okay.
sure.
All right. So I would say, is that better?
Yes, yeah. Very good.
Okay. I would say that the the whole woke ideology, it's based on postmodernism. And again, most people don't really know what that is. It's also called post-Enlightenment. But the idea of post, it doesn't mean that we're in a new world. It doesn't mean it's a new philosophical universe. It's just an attack on what went before. So Enlightenment ideas like science and are under attack, and they're all under attack under the idea that, and this comes from the postmodern philosophers like Michel Foucault, that the social order is just a way of keeping people in their place, of oppressing people who aren't part of the ruling majority are marginalized, they're oppressed, and that's their identity. And in fact, the argument is that their whole identity, it's socially constructed. It means that this is who you are. Again, this is why it's analogous to what happened in the Enlightenment and Marxism. They redefine human nature, and like those other revolutions, they say that the solution is to somehow reform the social order. Right? That's the only opportunity. So postmodernism, especially, is focused on two groups that they consider to be marginalized. One are racial minorities, and the other are what they call gender minorities, sexual minorities, right? So, and that's why race and gender are the they're the key topics of the academic left, and they have penetrated into the larger society in a way that Marxism never could. Because, as I mentioned before, class isn't such a big issue here in America. But obviously, we know that race is a huge issue. We have a history with slavery in it, and still, the problems that stem from racism and what followed haven't all been resolved. And then the gender as well. Because recently, we've come up with the idea of that there are all these different genders, and that if you're not part of the straight white male gender, that you're somehow in an oppressed position, right? So this is why people think it's like Marxism, because Marxism talks about oppression too, but it's oppression on a different axis, right? And it's systemic in a way that Marx imagined that after the revolution, everything would be great, but they don't have that kind of belief. It's just a constant struggle of fighting, and resistance is a popular term as well. And that's the basis of the woke ideology, and that's the basis of what DEI is, right? So DEI actually sounds innocuous. Who doesn't want, more diversity and more inclusion? God, inclusion sounds wonderful. But in fact, what it is the struggle of oppressed minorities against the system. And you hear this word systemic a lot. The racism and the sexism is systemic, which indicates the system is deeply flawed. The system is the problem. So we have to get rid of the system, right? There's no sense of what would replace it, though, and even their own theory doesn't offer a real alternative, but just constant struggle, right? So I don't know how I'm doing on time, but there's a lot more to say, but maybe I can leave it there.
You have a couple of minutes if you want to expand a little bit more.
Actually, I'll let Frank go, and then if there's
Okay,
time
we
at
can
the
come
end of
back,
that,
yeah.
I can share some more. Yeah.
Very
Okay,
good.
thanks a lot, David. The challenge of woke, it has yet to manifest how fully or extensively destructive to human life is inherent in its potential. All the revolutions always start with a very attractive proposition. Are there marginalized groups? Indeed. Are they disadvantaged? Indeed. Are people mean to them? Also. And on and on. And to present oneself as a person concerned about these affairs, little could be more attractive. So what's the effort of this program David and I developed in WICC Education is to point out the inherent potential for the range or extent of human destruction or elimination that lies in it. And woke is far more is infinitely more far-reaching than either of the prior revolutions. French killed hundreds of thousands. Marxism killed hundreds of millions, or over 100 million. French almost killed 100,000. The potential of woke is in the billions. It literally is. And here's where its inherent core flaws lie. It is not an attack on God, as David will have pointed out. It's post-atheistic. So it's an attack on discourse. It's an attack on meaning. It arises out of French philosophers that describe everything is merely a function of power, and language is a tool of oppression. Logic is a tool of oppression. standards or punctuality is a tool of oppression. So every foundation whereby human beings can begin to try to construct or pursue an ideal is undermined at the foundation of woke presuppositions. Its whole ontology is that it's just oppression and struggle. And so when you imagine that you have an identity, it's described as being, what is it, David? What is it?
Socially constructed.
Socially constructed. So it undermines the beginning point in which you could even indicate the possibility that you come from God. You don't even have identity. You don't even have the capacity to claim being created. So it removes meaning, it removes identity. This is why you see at the extreme fringes the fluidity of gender, because gender is the most hardwired dimension of human identity. Prior to the impact of woke ideology, what you call I is always perceived by the bearer of I as male or female. You can't think of yourself as other until the recent introduction of fluidity. But so meaning in language is removed, and a traceable identity that you can claim is removed. So the possibility of advocating for any sort of ideal harmony and virtue is undermined prior to the conversation itself. It's not an argument about what is virtuous, or it's not an argument about that white people have been oppressors. The key things that result in this metaphysical struggle that I'm describing is censorship. You can't speak. If you speak and presume that someone must comply with your with what you think words mean, you are expressing an Enlightenment Western European philosophical white male system on that is oppression. So you must silence is the obligation of anyone within the system of oppression. Gender, rule of law, patriotism, anything that is accounted for an ideal is preempted. And so the danger of wokeism is the impossibility of even introducing an ideal of harmony, of virtue, because it needs to be grounded in shared language, shared sense of right and wrong. And so this is what we're experiencing today. This is why we're flabbergasted to see seemingly a normal everyday human being in a suit or in a nice blouse and dress sitting on a school board in demanding that young people receive sex change operations, and it's illegal against the law to tell their parents. This is an extreme fringe version of what you get when you have no capacity to even begin a conversation or an affirmation of meaning, of language, of virtue, of speech, of community. Most people only just address the superficial manifestations of it, but David and I are trying to produce a clear account of what that ideology will ultimately produce in human affairs. Thanks, Hans.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think this is getting to the crux of what we're trying to address here on this webinar, is really how we, the listening audience, the moms and dads in the nation and around the world, can first of all understand what's going on, and the potential negative impact that it could have on your family life, your family culture, your community culture, national culture. So I have one more question, and again, there are a number of questions in the chat. It's a little bit beyond me to digest each one of them. But again, if either one of the panelists would like to address any of those questions, we have another 15 minutes. So I'd also like, after this one question, to invite Dr. Jenkins to share a few thoughts on our webinar today. I think he has a lot to say there as well. So the final question, what are some of the troubling phenomena happening today that you believe are tied in some way to wokeism? What is the solution to these sorts of problems? What can people do?
Mm. Well, let me yeah, the answer to the last question is challenging, but I can answer the first part, I think, easily enough. You know, what you see around you, as Frank was describing, it's an attack on identity, right? And again, based on the sort of postmodernist philosophy, there are no fixed meanings, there are no fixed identities. There is no truth. Right. I mean, you hear this a lot. So, for example, the expression "my truth," everybody talks about my truth. That's based on this kind of postmodern idea. There is no truth that we share or that we aspire to. It's just, you know, what I experience, what I feel, right? And this actually has profound implications of fracturing society, right? Dividing. It's a philosophy of division, right? But there are real things that are happening around, and sometimes people aren't even aware of it. So, for example, in elementary schools all across the country, our children, our children are being taught about things like the genderbread man, which is even now the gendered person because, you know, man is not correct. I don't know if you know what that is, but basically your students are being taught that gender is fluid, right? And one day you may identify one way, and one day you may identify another way. So this is straight out of the woke ideology, right? This idea that, and it's reaching you know, the youth of our nation. You know, it's not in every school, but it's in many. Many. Everywhere we've gone and presented our, you know, I always ask is who here is aware of this? And there's always some people that work in the schools who've seen it, right? So that's one example, right? That and generally the parents aren't even aware of this. You know, one of the things that came out of the pandemic was people became more aware of what their children were learning, right? So now we're aware of this sort of thing, but this attack on identity is everywhere. For example, you know, the southern border of the United States has been open, despite what people say. 10 million roughly people have crossed illegally. And why is that? Well, if you say that we should have borders, then it means that you're a racist, right? And that you know, this has been said, right? You hate brown people, so you don't want them to come into the country, right? This is again due to the woke ideology, right? So, and I mean, both parties, you know, always used to agree, you know, you have to have a border. President Clinton, you know, argued against having an open border, right? I mean, President Obama was called the deporter in chief, right? But things have changed, and again, I think it's based on this ideology. The struggle right now between the Israel and the Palestinians, right? All the campus protests that are taking place are based on woke ideology, that the Palestinians are the oppressed and the Israelis are the oppressors, and so It's this idea that good and evil is assigned based on the idea of which side of that divide you're on, right? So everywhere you look, there's example after example of the woke ideology influencing the way our culture operates. All of it, again, is an attack on identity, right? That the border situation is, it's an attack on the identity as Americans, right? Somehow you're not allowed to assert that. You're not. And if you remember during the George Floyd riots, they were pulling down statues, not just of Confederate generals, but of Lincoln and Washington. It didn't get a lot of press, but it happened. These founding fathers were considered oppressors, right? So, and that's straight out of the woke ideology, right? And so there's, I think you get the point. I could go on, but there's lots of examples of how this is impacting the way our culture operates and thinks today.
Yeah, thank you.
Hans, because of time, I'm going to jump across to a little kind of distillation of some of the elements of the counterproposal. Otherwise, it's very depressing to hear because the woke ideal is well established. It's not just rioters pulling down statues. It's all throughout both houses of Congress. It's everywhere. It's in corporate boardrooms. It's in K through 12. It's in the academy. So very, very quickly, I wish there was a little more time, but that's all right because we teach this in a day or over several days. So we're doing just a quick pointer. There are a massive number of people who remain religious for some reason or another. They're Hindus, they're Muslims, they're Jews, they're Christians, they're all over the world, they're all throughout America. A vast number of people are religious for some reason or another. Many times the particular religion that people have is because they're born into it. Occasionally you'll meet a convert now and then. But these are not people with blinders on or who are schizophrenic or fail to see reality or something like that. They're deliberately religious. And so there is in this group, which may be the majority, of people who are sure that the claims of the woke ideology that identity is socially constructed, they don't abide of it. They'll never abide of it. It's contrary to my mature, knowledgeable, intended way I live. So what is required in order to meet the challenges, which are extreme and everywhere, is things, and it comes directly out of unification roots. One is that America found a way to have Christians who were slaughtering each other to death in Europe in the 30 Years' War to none left to kill. America was a place where those very same people could create a unified commitment to life under God. That job exists once again for American people, not just for Christians of Europe anymore, but for every religious believer of every sort. So the ideal of genuine and true and thoroughgoing interreligious collaboration and cooperation while retaining our own commitments, that a way must be found. That is a necessary component to countering the force of woke ideology, because woke ideology claims to be a compassionate thing, as ugly and divisive as it is. Then the second thing is that the other roots of America is that our freedoms are God-given rights. They're God-given. So Americans constantly reiterate the refrain of our freedom coming from God in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, in the preamble, in the Bill of Rights. God-given freedom, freedom of speech, freedom to gather, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. What we introduce in WICC education is, why is this freedom given? Why? Now, why did God create human beings free? The punchline of that is, only with freedom can one love. Only with freedom can one love. So this is an augmentation or added affirmation of spiritual and religious American patriotism. Why? To love. What does love do whenever it happens, what does it do? It produces family. And family is the place where one can begin to effectively and fully construct a bulwark of common sense and also the genius that will be necessary to dissolve and undermine the force of wokeism, because wokeism is false by nature. But my love for my mom and dad is true by nature. The love of my mom and dad for me is true by my nature. So truth needs an embodied experiential force. And so the counterproposal in WICC education to woke ideology is intensifying the breadth of collaboration of fellow travelers in the religious world and accounting for why God created a nation with guarantees of ultimately family. And that's where wokeism will crash on the shoals of people who are loved, etc. Thereby the falsehood, the emptiness of woke ideology starts to collapse. And then you get geniuses who can articulate, who can put up the fight and articulate, etc. Thanks. I hope I wasn't long on that, but
yeah, no, thank you very much, both David and Frank, for taking the time and sort of giving us the essence of this project that you're embarking on. And I'd like to give Dr. Jenkins a few minutes just to share his thoughts. He is guiding the Universal Peace Federation here in America and even beyond for many, many years. And Dr. Jenkins, do you have a minute to share, or should we wrap it up here? I don't think he can hear me for some reason, but yeah, okay. So we've only got a couple of minutes, and what I'm going to do is just conclude the program then. So thank you for joining our discussion on this very important issue.
Hans,
we hope there are...
Hans,
yeah?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
A ton of questions came in. I didn't dare look at them. I was trying to keep my concentration.
I copied them all. I copied them. I'm going to put them in an email. I'll send them out to you. And
yeah, I don't
who
want
asked
anyone
them.
to feel offended or we were ignoring them. I could see them for a split second, but I couldn't dare entertain them. I really wanted to not lose my effort to try to communicate. So apologies to the people who posted.
Yeah, I think everybody understands. Okay, so I hope what we shared today has given you some insights and some guidelines for possibly how you can be more aware of what's going on. Dr. Jenkins, would you like to share something, just a minute or two here we have left?
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Really so happy to be part of this discussion. Thank you for the presentations and the really understanding how ideology and how certain viewpoints of the order of creation, the order of and purpose of life, if those foundations are actually based on the rejection of God, the rejection of truth and love, and replaced with an ideology or some kind of a systemic teaching that denies the value of God, the creation, and also the existence of a divine being. And it's fascinating because it's an unbelievable thing that when you think that if you have the wrong fundamental principles, false principles, and wrong thinking, it affects your viewpoint, it affects everything. It's always fascinating to me how people can also affirm those false teachings, false ideas, until finally the value of existence is denied. There is no value. And I am fascinated how all this comes back to putting man or mankind or the individual man or woman in the center. Everything centers on my own identity, and I decide who I am. It was fascinating what David was talking about, that I think, therefore I am. I decide what gender I am. I decide, what value is most important for my own happiness. That really is the essence of what it becomes. I was thinking the other day about the whole idea of you can decide your own gender. It's not based on any, it's a subjective identity. Therefore, I can identify myself. I decide who I am. I decide what gender I am. I can choose whatever. It's not based on truth. It's based on subjectivity that pushes God out, pushes, fundamental values and principles out, and then replaces them with a self-centered and self focus that is so destructive to everything. And it's really quite amazing when you see this supreme elevation of the individual as the highest value and the author of all truth. What is truth is what I decide it is. Then you find out you're actually ultimately destroying the purpose of life and destroying the family. And that's where it goes. It's fascinating to me that it's like the very essence of the purpose of life, to have family and to become, parents, and to become, people of value, living for the sake of others. That is all completely rejected. And when you get that to a place of being totally rejected, then there's chaos, total chaos. What I'm also amazed is how it occurs slowly over time until people don't even know how our schools got where they are, how our principles of truth and science even are objective to the decision of people, not based on objective science or an objective observation. So it's really, ideology is so important. Our ideas, our thinking. When people don't think it really matters that much. I'm just living in this world and that kind of thing. So I think that this battle that what's being discussed today is a critical battle. The battle for what is truth and what is the purpose of life. And I'm very encouraged to hear what the analysis, and to understand how destructive it is if there is the rejection of a divine being, the rejection of truth, and how destructive it is. You end up not being free. You end up living for the sake of self, and that your supreme identity, your supreme value is then greater than anything else because I'm the center of the universe. So that is where we're at. But fascinating to me how even the women's identity and women's movement and the good side of the women's efforts in history to find equality and to find balance, that itself becomes destroyed when you say there's no universal standard of truth. It's whatever I say it is. And my grandson was sharing with me how they had a self-identification exercise. How do you self-identify? And it was really funny because he said he and his friend were already on to the foolishness of this whole thing, that you can identify whatever you think you are, is that what you are? Whatever gender you think you are is what you are. And they were all asked to self-identify, whether they're boys or girls or who are you? What's your identity? And he and his friend came up with a really interesting idea. He said, he told the teacher, I'm going to self-identify as a Samsung smart fridge. We laughed so hard, I couldn't believe it. You know, he was like 11. But that's where it goes. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to working together on this because this, DEI, it's an amazing thing, how it becomes exactly the opposite of what it's talking about. It denies diversity, equity, and inclusion. It completely rejects everything in the name of putting my view over everyone else. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Some good concluding remarks. David or Frank, anything you'd like to say in response, or shall we wrap it up?
I'd really like to thank you and your team, Hans.
Thank you.
This is it's matured over the years of constant effort, the IMAP meetings like this, and I guess I speak for David too, but it was a blessing and a very good experience to be with you. Thank you for your work and for this particular session also.
Thank you, David and Frank, for coming. We really appreciate it. I put the link to your website, the Settlement Project, in the chat. Please, everyone, go visit, find out more, and get in contact. Please invite Frank and David to come to your neighborhood, and like Mr. Rogers, let's start there. But also, please be sure to visit the UPF USA YouTube channel for recordings of all the webinars produced by UPF associations for the last few years. They're very educational and cover a wide variety of topics. So I wish everyone a wonderful week, and thank you again for participating today, and we'll close it here.